Okay, a final rejoinder. So, what did we do today? We thought about kind of the first of the two imperatives of border management as we discussed it last week, and specifically the imperative of fostering, facilitating, enabling the circulation of trade, commodities, and financial flows. And we try to contextualize the reasons why that imperative has been promoted in, well, neoclassical ideas about the invisible hand of the market and the positive relation between integration of national economies into the global economy for economic growth. We try to contextualize this on the perception that the best way to finance development intervention is by enabling foreign direct investment inflows into developing countries. And we used a series of organizations, development organizations, document to support those two claims, whether the Economic Commission for Africa, the World Bank, the WTO, the World Economic Forum. Indeed, we even had a slide on the UK Parliament. All promote a whole series of policies that foster integration. Now, of course, if you have read the news over the last, well, effectively ever since the previous US election campaign, you would have seen how these ideas are being increasingly questioned, and importantly are being increasingly questioned by powerful states such as the United States or indeed the UK to a certain extent, or at the very least a redefinition of that complex interplay between global economy, whatever that means in practice, and regional economics, or between different forms of integration into the global economy, are being questioned, revisited, and rethought about. And this is already an indication that we cannot exclusively think of the imperative of fostering integration through an economic lens. The two readings, the two core readings for this week, highlighted different dimensions of what may be the political or politico-economic issues associated to the success of at the border or behind the border measures that are aimed at fostering integration and the circulation of financial and capital flows, and indeed fostering the export and import of commodities and more in general trade integration. But there are many more. I mentioned the example of labor standards as another way of questioning or challenging the very meaning of what is a successful integration, and successful from whose perspective. I mean, it certainly seems that there are different benefits to be reaped from markets integration, and more broadly that the transformations that are engendered by at the border as much as behind the border measures, well, as any transformation, will produce some winners and some losers. There is no win-win solution here or pretty much in anything else related to development. And so how do we understand these transformations? How can we explain, for example, why there has been a proliferation of trade agreements over the last 3 decades, or why all of a sudden the ideas that led to the proliferation of free trade agreements across the world are now being questioned by powerful states. And here, I mean, I don't have any simple answer. I will, in a sense, resort to the bottom line, if you wish, of this course, and think about how to interpret border-related transformations across the world. And so I want to conclude this session by thinking about the three main positions that we explored from week 2 onwards. The first one of which goes back to state and elite interests. Go back to your slide and see how there is a connection between what I'm about to say and the previous slides. And so here again, and these are all readings that you should be able to find in your further readings, perhaps not the UNDP and the World Bank Global Economic Prospects report, but those you can easily find through a Google search. Here again, the concerns put forward by these reports and these authors explain the proliferation of trade agreements on the basis of powerful state interests, on the basis of the interests of elites or particular social groups that are able to shape policies in this respect. So, for example, one of the few examples in which the World Bank acknowledges the existence of more politically grounded interests in its Global Economic Prospect report of 2005, talks about the difference between high-income countries such as the US and the EU and low-income countries, and explains their participation and agreement to sign FTAs on the basis of their own peculiar interests. UNDP, again, explains how quite often countries, just sign up without any political commitment or the formulation of a coherent development strategy exclusively for its fear of exclusion. There are specific examples, such as the one put forward by Tussi, in which trade agreements are seen in a more defensive sense, or Beeson and Brown talk instead about geopolitical concerns that overlap and intersect with geoeconomic forces and imperatives, right? In any case, the key common concern of these authors and reports is to kind of privilege explanations as to why so many trade agreements, why are these policies so popular on the basis of state interest or powerful state interest. And again, you can find parallels to this line of thought partly in both of your core readings. I mean, the first one talking about contrasting political imperatives and in fact active challenges and disruption at different levels, different governance levels in which these management practices take place. And the second one more concerned with the relative size of the economies of member states or states that have agreed to sign an FTA. So powerful states here seems to take the interest. A second broad set of explanations is more political economic in character. Here again, the view or the perspective relates to the proliferation at global level. In other words, there is perhaps an abstraction from the specific interests of states and elites within states. And again, go back to week 2, there is a constant reference to capital's imperatives and to the kind of border management policies that would foster the conditions for capitalist development, not for development in terms of economic growth like the World Bank, but in terms of increased rate of profits, which arises from an increased exploitation, or if you go by Harvey, the need to overcome the crises that mar capitalist accumulation, and so on and so forth. And so here you have a collection of political economists that emphasize in different aspects of that relation, kind of explain these transformations in the way in which borders are seen as a problem and border management of a particular kind, i.e. of the kind that fosters integration, is seen as the solution to such problems through the lens of political economy. Okay? A third strand that is much more concerned with social relations, with categorizations, or indeed with challenging the classical categorizations to which we talk about states, jurisdictions, the law, linearly defined identities and the such, actually brings to the fore the longer histories of integration that exist across the world and have somewhat predate the institutional interest in trade agreements. So Soderbaum and Taylor, for example, in a very interesting chapter that I suggest you to read within the further reading list, talk about, well, perhaps they make a distinction between regionalism and regionalization, with the first one being a process of institutional change that is kind of state-led, and the second being a kind of a more bottom-up encounter and exchange-based process of integration and hybridization and exchange of populations that long predates the establishment of borders, or indeed the institutional transformations associated to regional trade agreements. Similar issues are of concern to Tim Reimakers, or indeed to Achille Mbembe in different forms. Again, here the starting point is the challenging and the questioning of both the abstract explanations, more abstract explanations, as they would call them, of political economists that tend to see these transformations as a result of the imperatives of capitalist development, or indeed the more geopolitical, if you wish, explanations that are premised on powerful state interests and emphasize the situated and more embodied, historically shaped encounters and exchanges that create, if you wish, an alternative form of integration that is quite often on the losing out side of things when it comes to formalizing trade agreements. And you can think about formal and informal trade, or the formalization of informal trade associated, for instance, to one-stop border posts in this respect. So what to take away from all of this? Well, perhaps two things. One, the idea of thinning borders, perhaps this is the most important, to think about the distinction between border lines as divisions in a world-bank sense and borders as divisions. And this is a way of thinking perhaps at the kind of problem-solution circular border management question in relation to at the border measure, the first one in relation to border lines, and behind the borders. So if you are concerned with reducing the divisions created by border lines, if you wish, if you see border lines as choke points to the smooth cross-border movement of trade, commodities, and people, well, you need to invest in infrastructure, technology, and coordination between border guard forces, right? You intervene at the border through capacity building, through improved, more efficient procedure, through investment in technology, through the reduction of red tape by technological means, for example, through scanning, etc., etc. Again, for those of you who are familiar with the UK debate, all the discussions about the invisible border across the Irish island and how you could still be able to have an invisible border even in light of two quite different, as would be expected, jurisdictions, the EU jurisdiction of the Republic of Ireland and that of the British one in Northern Ireland, are apt in point. So the way in which technology is seen as a solution to these kind of issues is exemplary, both in contexts such as the Brexit one or the European one more in general, and in developing countries at large. But we also talked about an important aspect. We went just beyond the borderline and tried to include, even if they somewhat escape the classical coordinated or integrated border management concerns, we try to think about behind the border measures that are put in place to facilitate circulation and integration. And they refer to anything that smoothes out jurisdictional differences in regulation, in standards, in procurements, in reporting and accounting measures, and so on and so forth. So it's about adherence to international standards, and it's about the creation of new governance arrangements, such as those related to FTAs. It is by reducing divisions both at the border line and divisions created by borders more in general that you can foster trade and investment, which in turn is the only engine and the real engine for development, which is in turn the only way we can alleviate poverty. Or at least so the argument goes, and it is for you to find pitfall fallacies, if any, at each one of these stages. And in fact, one can even go beyond these specific concerns and the challenges and critiques that we've raised in the different parts of the section to talk about what is not talked about at all, such as land property relations, double standards, of which agricultural subsidies are the perhaps most important example. But we can also think about what are the forces that are driving what some people call the current protectionist turns, or what happens with other movements. The key point that I wanted to introduce through the first group exercise, and that it kind of reverberated throughout these 4 parts of this session, relates to context, to the need to insert economic policies, economic ideas about integration and markets in the specific contexts, be they local, national, regional, or global, in which they take place. And the 3 ways of interpreting this transformation that we explore in this 4th part, well, are the recurrent one for us, and also try to understand them in this way.